Welcome back to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's returning guest is Kelly Vlahos, who has come on a couple of times now. She is from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, who do lots of good work there. I was having just a quick look at the website just before we started, obviously covering a complete range of foreign policy topics from Iran, Israel, Ukraine, China, Azerbaijan and Armenia, everything there, and the different kind of options the US government and NATO could be taking. But it's great to have you here again, Kelly. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's always good to have you on. Yeah. So as I kind of said before, there's a lot going on in the world. Obviously, Israel and Gaza everyone's obviously following the moment. Ukraine's obviously in the background, and then you get the odd kind of period like with the balloons with China, where there's tensions. But obviously, you've got Iran now, Yemen. But so I'm happy to kind of just see where you want to go. But just actually, I had a question for you. It's kind of it's on topic, but kind of, I guess, more random. So obviously, Sweden has just been finally ratified by Hungary. It seems like the deal was that now Sweden's going to sell them some fighter jets, which is always funny when the hold up isn't, some morality thing, or it's just about weapons, or with Turkey and the Kurds and things like that. But why do you think it is Sweden and Finland have now, after all years of neutrality, decided to join NATO? Because especially with the way the world order's moving towards this multipolar world, it's interesting Sweden and Finland took the decision now to kind of back America, kind of like Norway and Denmark seem to be stepping up support in Ukraine and things like that. So why do you think is it Sweden and Finland decided to join NATO now, especially considering, they must see NATO as a US kind of stranglehold over these countries? So why do you think they've decided to join now? Or just, speculation or anything?
Well, I mean, purely speculation and based on what their leadership and their elites are saying is that they feel threatened by Russia. And so that they have taken the sort of existential leap away from neutrality and more towards the transatlantic alliance with all of the deterrence and security value that they think comes with it. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there who believe that their entering into NATO is actually going to exacerbate the tensions between Russia, which, contrary to what some people believe, Russia has felt threatened enough to invade Ukraine, that NATO had come up to its shores and doors and borders over the last 30 years. This having Sweden and Finland join that march towards the borders of Russia is not going to make things better. It's going to make things more tense. I think it will complicate whatever security arrangements, discussions, deals, agreements that will have to come to bear after the war in Ukraine ends more complicated. But it is what it is. At the Quincy Institute, Responsible Statecraft, for which I'm the editor, hadn't really come out very strongly against the NATO expansion in this regard. But it is interesting to see two countries that have done fairly well being so neutral, particularly Finland, which has had this neutrality arrangement since World War II, have done very well for itself, kind of fall under the spell of NATO and the idea that without that security umbrella, that it would be vulnerable. They also get a lot from it. Obviously, they're going to be getting weapons. They're going to be getting the nuclear umbrella. They're going to be getting training and do, joint exercises with the membership countries. So they get a lot out of it. They also have to put a lot into it too. So I know that the common story, or the current story right now, is Trump has been raising the specter of not getting out of NATO, but pushing them and pushing each member to spend up to 2% or 2% rather threshold to be a member. And that's gonna have to come out of their coffers. So it doesn't come for free, but they do get a lot out of it. I think what the world gets out of it is a more hostile Russia, and the tensions that are already obviously so high with a hot war going on in Ukraine. I don't see how this makes things any easier in terms of ending that war. I think it probably makes it more difficult.
Do you think the leaders of those countries who kind of made these decisions really do believe that Russia is a security threat to them, or do you think they saw it as an opportunity to maybe use this to join NATO? And on the weaponry, would they not already kind of have those deals with the US and kind of sophisticated weaponry? What else do you think they're kind of getting out of it?
I do feel like they get a lot more. So obviously there had been tangential arrangements. There had been exercises that they'd already been involved with, military to military. They get a lot more out of this. As far as what they believe, I do think that there is a sense of drinking the Kool-Aid when it comes to the NATO members, the European elites. They are pretty four square behind the idea that Russia is an existential threat to Europe and to the transatlantic community in general. I think we'd be surprised, and you'd know more than me being where you are in Europe. I think that there is less conflict between the way people think about the war in Ukraine there than there is here. Here, there is a lot of debate about it. I know the mainstream media and our foreign policy elites are pretty much in support of continuing the war in Ukraine, but there is an active resistance to it. I don't know if there's as much, at least among elites in Europe. So I think everybody is pretty well conditioned to seeing Russia as a major threat, to seeing Putin as an evil dictator, to see the Russian Federation as a threat to democracy. So but I can't crawl into the heads of the leadership there, but I feel like a lot of it is ideological, as well as, yes, I'm sure there's some transactional nature to their decision or their quest for being in NATO as well.
See, I would have said, I mean, on the general population level, that Europeans may have a different view of Russia than the US, as in a lighter view, as in they don't see them as much of a threat as the US. I mean, again, it gets confusing when you speak about governments and the establishment and the people, but I'd say Europe, I think it's different, me being in England and the UK, because we're so aligned with the US compared to other European countries, that I think the way our establishment thinks in the UK and America is very similar, and the media. So we often have a pretty aligned view, especially on China. You know, most European countries don't seem as on board about the whole China threat, but the UK are one of those countries. So we are kind of in between that. But I mean, I would say, again, I don't speak to loads of people, but I think they do see the US in different terms of more of an empire and Russia. So I'm not really sure there, but maybe it's just obviously the actual governments of those countries could well think that, or they're heavy ideologues towards kind of the American system, and they maybe do see this in more of the multipolar world breaking out and saying, no, we need to back the US rules-based international order, and means NATO. I'm not. There's a lot of obviously speculation that it could be. I guess just moving, the conversation on with everything going on in Israel. Before I guess we get to that, what do you think there is outside of that people aren't kind of focusing on as much? It can be Ukraine, Yemen, obviously tied into this Iran. I guess that's more Israel side, but China, Ukraine, Azerbaijan. Anything you kind of want to convey to people you think is important that they may not be as focused on, including Ukraine again?
Well, I think the attention has kind of shifted away from Ukraine since October 7th and the Hamas attacks and the ensuing war in Gaza. But I'm feeling that the gravity is starting to pull back there. Why? I think people are starting to realize more and starting to talk about more the what they're seeing as an inevitability of Ukraine collapsing and the war collapsing, the military effort on Ukraine's behalf just imploding. And I, I've talked to people, and you've probably talked to a number of experts too, who say it's not a matter of if anymore, it's just when. And I think that's just very sobering. And it's coming at a time when Washington support for the Ukraine war is waning. And you see that with the battles for the Ukraine aid package that Biden has been promoting relentlessly. They can't seem to get it passed through the Congress. It's mostly because of the Republicans. But I'm starting to hear a shift in tone, even on behalf of Democrats, who are talking more about wanting to see an end to the war, wanting to see a strategy for ending the war, diplomacy. And they are also distracted by other things, whether it be the presidential election, what's going on in Israel, Gaza, the border debate, a domestic border debate. And so it couldn't have come at a worse time for Ukraine, which has exhausted all of its weapons. It's exhausted all of its soldiers. It's trying to change its draft laws so that it could conscript more soldiers. And that's resulted in a lot of resistance from the men in Ukraine who are being pulled sometimes into vans in their own neighborhoods against their will to fight. And we're seeing more and more stories about that and videos about that. And so the morale is crushing. And Europe, as you mentioned, Europe often takes the cue of America in terms of monetary support and even emotional support for these things. And you're starting to see a waning in Europe as well. You're seeing far-right parties in Germany, for example, ascendant in part because of how the economy has been so debilitated by the war effort and the industrial collapse in Germany. The sanctions on Russia have not had their intended effect. If anything, they've made the economic situation for Europe worse. And so all these factors are playing into a general fatigue with the war. And meanwhile, Ukrainians are still dying on the battlefield. And it breaks my heart because I feel like the West pushed and pushed and pushed and told Zelensky that they would give him everything he needed to crush Russia and set these goals like expunging Russia completely from the country, retaking Crimea. And when it came down to it, the West wasn't going to be willing to put its own flesh into this situation, meaning we're not willing to put our own troops in there. We're not willing to give them the long-range missiles that they might need. I don't even know if those would work at this point, but we promised a lot. And then when things got tough and our stocks started getting depleted and our budget started drying up and our politics started roiling, all of a sudden the reality is that the promises were just that, written on the wind. And I feel bad. I feel bad for Zelensky because, whereas he had gone to all of these world capitals in the past with his hat in hand and he'd get it filled up right away, now he makes a lot of speeches. And yeah, sure, people like Jens Stoltenberg, head of NATO, will return his entreaties and say, we're right there behind you. And yes, someday you'll get into NATO and we'll give you everything you got. And you have French President Macron saying yesterday that they're even considered putting troops into Ukraine. A lot of this is coming off as very empty. And now we have experts saying that it's just a matter of weeks maybe where Ukraine is just going to fall. Now, will the whole country fall? No. But the military campaign is all but tapped out, which puts Russia in a much better position at a negotiating table. But as you know, we've said at Quincy, and we've had numerous stories on responsible statecraft say that means that we got to get to this negotiating table sooner than later, because at some point the Russians may not even want to talk because they're going to be in such in such a catbird seat. And so I think Washington needs to get off its ass and start getting some talks going with Russia, because I think it is our obligation at this point to be directly involved and to facilitate this.
Yeah, I think because of the nature, this has been such a US NATO proxy war against Russia. It's almost a shame for the Ukrainians, as in from the perspective of kind of, I guess, the anti-war side, people almost kind of just lump them in it. And it's hard not to feel bad for the Ukrainians because, as you said, they've been told by the West, we're gonna, back you till the end, basically, like we've obviously said to other countries. And now the arms are drying up, and they've kind of just been completely, obviously, caught in the crosshairs. But it's almost they've kind of lacked sympathy from certain people because they're part of this proxy war, but they're the actual ones getting punished. And who knows what they was told at the start. And obviously we've all seen the stories and heard it from Naftali Bennett that there was a peace deal that Israel was mediating, and the US and UK came in and basically squashed it to carry on. It's just a real shame, I guess, from the Ukraine perspective, because they do almost lack sympathy because people are sick of money getting sent there as well. So they're like, oh, screw the Ukrainians, that money's for us. And they've just been kind of caught up in this. Yep. And I find it interesting that Macron came out and said this now, considering France hasn't really been a massive backer of kind of the Ukraine war. Obviously, at the start, them and Germany were kind of on the fence. Germany's obviously gone, one of the biggest backers now, but it was, an empty statement saying we can't rule out troops. He put together this conference, but France has never really been that invested in this. So, that was completely empty. Where do you see the Ukraine war going? Obviously, you can obviously, this is what we're here. We have heard, obviously, the whole time Ukraine is going to collapse at any minute. And I think eventually, obviously, they will. But they have gone on a lot longer than people obviously said from the start. And I think people who said that would agree with that. So is this going to be a case where, again, the can's going to get kicked down the road? Because, again, I've said this before, Russia's fighting in Ukraine. So even if Russia pulls out, you can call it a win for Ukraine, but Ukraine's never going to march on to Moscow and win. So eventually Ukraine are going to lose in some way, whether it's a stalemate or not. But do you think this is really kind of finally it, or is the can going to get kicked down the road and the Republicans, and the Democrats do come to an agreement, as they say, we actually are at the point of running out of everything. Let's get the money back over. Obviously, there's lots of European countries who are still sending stuff for a lot of the Nordic. Where do you see it going? Do you think this is really it, or is it the can going to get kicked down the road for another year or so?
It's hard to say. One of the scenarios that people have been talking about is that the Biden administration doesn't want to be seen as losing this war right before an election. So he could he could stop pushing for the aid, start pushing for some negotiation now, stop the blood on the battlefield, and move things in a more positive direction, so that if it looks like Ukraine has lost the battle, they got to move on. At least he does that now, before several months before the election, and then avoids like a catastrophe happening, say in September, October, and all the images of the Russians winning or Ukraine collapsing would just be bad optics. That's very cynical take, but people are talking about it because in this country, things, the presidential elections actually do shape events, unfortunately, political and policy-driven events in this country, and things are timed by the election so that whoever's running the different parties can either avoid bad optics or benefit from good ones. My fear is that those forces on Capitol Hill who have been very much behind giving Ukraine everything it wants are going to use some of this bad news that's happening and push harder and maybe ram through the aid so that they can not only give Ukraine more money to keep the war going, but even maybe some of these long-range missiles that they've been asking for so long. I've been seeing stories throughout the media over the last, say, 3 or 4 days that keep raising the prospect of giving them longer-range missiles. And I'm thinking that maybe some of this talk by Macron and others about putting troops is maybe just a cover for them all to agree on the long-range missiles and say, well, we're not going to put troops in yet, but we'll give you these missiles instead. So my fear is that the hawks in this case will prevail, that Ukraine will get money to keep going. But every military expert that I've talked to say it's not going to matter because they'll have the money, but they'll never get the weapons ramped up in time because there's depletion in the factories, there's depletion in the stocks, even in the United States, and so they have to actually build a lot of these weapons. They have to start ramping up production, and that's not going to happen with a snap of the fingers. So we might be able to get them some things to keep it going, but it won't be enough. So it's just going to prolong the hurt, and so that's one scenario. Another would be that the money drives up, and like I said, there'll be some diplomatic push to get everybody to the table. But unfortunately, I don't really see that happening, like the latter happening. I don't see a lot of diplomatic activity. Whenever members of Congress or the administration or their surrogates in the media speak about this, it's always with the same mantra that we're behind Ukraine, we're going to give it, what it needs, we'll just keep fighting for the aid. If we don't do it, democracy is under threat. If we don't do it, Russia will rampage across its borders and start wars with its neighbors and perhaps even the entire earth. I mean, you've heard all the hyperbole. So I don't really have a lot of confidence that there's a big diplomatic game going on. I guess that would be my wish, though. But other than that, everything else is really just speculation and trying to read the tea leaves politically in terms of what might happen next.
Yeah, it is very much just kind of going to have to see what actually happens and how it plays out. Obviously, we're about over 2-year anniversary was recently of the war, no, or three,
2
years, wasn't it? Of the war. How do you kind of assess this war, kind of compared to kind of other US foreign policy adventures that have come to a failing end, obviously like Afghanistan? Is this just another sign that US foreign policy is just on the downhill and kind of plays into the not that the US empire is just going to collapse like previous ones? Because I think with how it's built up around our system and other countries, it's a bit different to previous kind of empires. But is this just another kind of US foreign policy catastrophe that just kind of shows that the US empire is kind of on going downhill, basically? Do you rate it kind of high compared to other kind of previous US foreign policy failures?
Yeah, I mean, and I also see it also part of a pattern or a trajectory, because the Afghanistan war was supposed to be the good war. So when things went sideways in Iraq, right about the time that Obama was running for president, he came into office and he declared in so many words that we're not going to do the same mistakes in Afghanistan or as we did in Iraq. And also we're going to take some of the good lessons, which they assumed was counterinsurgency in Iraq, and apply them to Afghanistan and do a much better job. And so we all know what happened there. We poured more troops into Afghanistan. We didn't read the room. We never learned the culture. We never took the people and their systems seriously, and never took them into consideration. We were constantly trying to impose our own systems, our own values on Afghanistan, and we poured billions and trillions of dollars into that war and failed and left the Taliban in charge 2 years ago. And some people, and I believe this is true, saw what was happening in Ukraine, the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, as a way to sort of a cathartic moment to sort of right the wrongs of U.S. policy over the previous 20 years. Now, was that a overt or conscious decision? No, but I think a lot of that was playing into the narrative of Ukraine. A lot of people who had been tired, who had been critical, had been in opposition to the U.S. war policies in Afghanistan and Iraq were suddenly very excited about the prospect of doing good and saving the Ukrainian people from the Russian invasion, the Russian menace. A lot of those people had already been very full on board with the anti-Russian narrative that had built up throughout the Trump years. They saw Russia as the ideal enemy. And I think that sense that Ukraine was the new good war, that, and maybe just an idealistic sense that the United States had an obligation to help the Ukrainians against this illegal invasion, which it was an illegal invasion, fed into already a war-like mindset that Washington already has, that it can fix problems by adding more weapons, adding more fuel, and leaving diplomacy on the back burner. And as you can see, again, it hasn't worked out. We've poured tons, billions of dollars of weapons, billions of dollars of resources and training and funding our NATO partners. We know now that's been a ton of CIA and other operatives in country. And with all that effort, Ukraine is still about to lose their war against Russia. Again, the people who had warned that diplomacy, that we needed to talk, that we needed strategic empathy in the situation, were shunted away and marginalized. And billions of dollars later, and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost because of our hubris. The sense that we are the indispensable nation, and somehow we might not have gotten it right in Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, but we are going to help Ukraine get it right, and with our help. And I'm looking at Zelensky now, and he's probably thinking, thanks for the help. Thanks for nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there you just referred to I think it's the 12 spy camps or military bases that the CIA built in Ukraine since 2014 after the government was overthrown. And I think I saw, I think it was in a New York Times piece where after the Ukrainian government was overthrown in 2014, the new kind of people who stepped in, I think it was the new, someone in the kind of intelligence service, the first call he made was straight to the CIA chief, and the next one was to the MI6, which was an interesting that he actually said that in the article, which would say that they already had links before that happened. But just going on to what you said there, because it's kind of bizarre to think about that the mindset of kind of them as the US empire, how they run it. They seem everything they try and do goes almost against them, at least in the last 20 years. And what they want to achieve seems to cause their own mess. Like they pushed China, Iran, and Russia all together. This whole BRICS setup is the US pushing these countries together who probably would have never been allies, because they obviously had their own kind of quarrels over the years, and it's kind of hard to understand. It's almost like that's why people, I guess, think they're almost they create their own mess so they can then clean it up. Or like, it's bizarre kind of thinking about their mindset. Is it almost like the US system is so kind of it's set up almost to fail, and that there's too much greed involved with the arms lobbies? So say the Ukraine war, someone comes to these people and says, listen, this is what Ukraine's chances actually look like, all this stuff. And then all these special interests just say, don't worry about that. We need to make some money in the meantime, like Afghanistan or Iraq. They're like, it's failed. And they're like, it's either, they don't want to give up on it. It almost seems like the whole special interest side of it means the US empire isn't really set up to actually go, this is how we could do it most efficiently. It's always kind of these special interests you create these issues, like in Yemen or wherever it may be, and they just have the same solution that seems on their downfall. What do you think is it that these people, do you think they believe their own rhetoric that, like you said, we failed in Iraq, Afghanistan, and basically everything we was trying to do? Is it their goals are just something else that we don't see, or is it just, as you said, maybe the empire hubris that takes over and they think they're kind of indestructible? What do you think is? Because they must see they failed here and they failed here and they failed here, unless they just have different objectives to what they say. And I'm sure they have some, and there's different things we don't see. But what do you think it is? Because they keep scoring own goals, and China and Russia are getting stronger. Russia's probably got stronger since this war. So, what do you think it is that why they keep doing this?
Well, I think there is a lot going on here that we probably could spend another hour talking about, and I'm probably not going to do anything justice. So if I try to take it all on, I do think that over the last 70 years, post World War II, there have been bubbles created. And the two biggest ones, I think, are with the military leadership and then the civilian foreign policy leadership. And I say bubbles in that I think the people who have risen to the top, who are promoted on the military side, are not your best and brightest. They're not the most critical thinking. They are conditioned to go ahead, get along, salute. They are very politically astute people, but that doesn't mean that they're thinking outside the box or creatively. And I think on the parallel side, in the foreign policy establishment, you have people who have come up from the Ivy League ranks, Harvard, Yale, Princeton. They all think the same. They all look the same. They are all very well bred, but to be part of that culture, of that body, you have to accept certain things and certain doctrines about how foreign policy and diplomacy and national security should be laid out and measured and produced. And that doesn't leave a lot, again, for critical thinking, for thinking outside the box, about really challenging assumptions and the status quo. It just means you're in a club, and when you join a club, you have to like adhere to the uniformity of that club. And I think maybe the better word for it is not bubble but club. And these in crowds of these two powerful institutions are running our foreign policy and our military policy. And it means that they are devoid of learning lessons, of introspection, admitting failure. And so they end up promoting failed people, failed policies. And that's why you see a lot of these people, if you talk to them at a dinner or at a party or at a conference and you say, yeah, the Iraq war was a total failure of US foreign policy. And they'll go, oh, well, absolutely. Like now you're allowed to say it, but would they ever not bring on somebody like John Bolton or Victoria Nuland or you name one of those people onto a panel, onto a media interview? Would they not? Particularly Victoria Nuland is one of the most powerful people in the State Department. She's the number 2 right now. So you have this really creepy universe of people who are failed individuals or failed professionals who maintain their status as the top thinkers and doers, and voila, you have failed wars, one after the other. You have a State Department that can't negotiate outside of a paper bag. Like they have no interest in talking to Russia. And they actually say that. They talk like they're military people. So there's no diplomacy going on. And the military people sometimes are less hawkish than the State Department. But do you think that they're going to give up their footprint in any one country? Are they going to just say, hey, let's pack it up and go home? This isn't for us? No, because that would be an existential threat to themselves, because they need to be doing something. They just don't, at this point, they're not doing anything right. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would say. I know there's a lot more going on with the military industrial complex, and you brought up the arms industry and everything, and that's very important. But I feel like if they're the lodestars of what our foreign policy and national security policy is, we're in trouble.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And as you said, there's a lot of factors. But I mean, if you looked at the US empire as a company, say it was a company, there's no way any CEO would let it be run like that. It doesn't work. If it was a company, all these people keep failing and they're like, oh, let's give him a promotion. The company would just fall apart. But
Right.
with the empire, there's so many different parts, it doesn't work. But if it was a company, no one would be looking like that. They're like, here's our objectives. We need to hit this and we need to increase by this next year and grow by that. And it wouldn't work. But as you said, people get rewarded for mistakes. If you voted on the Iraq war, your career would be improved by it. If you voted against it, which now, as you said, you'd speak to people, they'd say the Iraq war was a mistake, but you can never do it at the time. Ukraine, eventually people will say, yeah, well, that was another Iraq. But at the time, you can never call it out within this system. Otherwise, you won't get that promotion or you won't get that show. And as you said, the media still bring on people like John Bolton, who pushed the Iraq war, got it completely wrong, to then push another war somewhere else that again failed. And this system of just rewarding people who go along with that current thing, wherever it may be, and don't reward people who actually made the right decision. If you actually had someone in government who spoke out and said, listen guys, I'm not speaking out for morality, I'm speaking out because I want to build the company, the empire, to the best ability. He's saying this is a mistake, but you can't, because it's all a self-serving kind of interest, careerist, all these factors. But as I said, if it was a company, it'd be run into the ground, and they'd be like, we can't run like this. It doesn't work. But I know you probably got to jump off soon. So do you have kind of another 5-10 minutes?
Yes.
Do you have a sharp? Yeah. Sorry, I started a tad late, but I just thought we could finish on Israel. Feel free to pick however you want to go at it, because there's lots of different aspects. There's the actual destruction of Gaza, the aid, lack of aid getting in, the way Israel's going about the campaign, the ICJ, the US role. So I guess it seems like the clear attempts that they want people out of Gaza and never have them return. So pick, I guess, what side of things you want to go at. There's obviously lots of different aspects, but what's been kind of your assessment of it so far? And again, just pick where you want to go with, because there's so many different ways you can speak about it.
Well, I mean, I think the biggest, I mean, aside from all the death and destruction in Gaza, which is unbelievably mind-blowing, the other thing that's dying a slow death is U.S. credibility in the world. I mean, I've been a critic of U.S. foreign policy for as long as I can remember, and I've always thought their credibility was thin and false. The duplicity on which all of our policies, whether it be in Vietnam or Iraq, and the Cold War and the war on terror, have shown us to be, rules breakers. So we've never really held up the rules-based order, only when we saw fit, and when we didn't, we didn't. But I think that is so on display now that it makes all of those past transgressions look like kids' play. We are supporting this war in Gaza that I think the time that we're recording is close to 30,000 people dead, mostly civilians. I think it's 17,000 children. And then you have the starvation and disease that is just rampant, and there's no end in sight. And we have given unconditional support to Israel, and we have allowed our weapons to be used in unbelievably non-humanitarian ways on the ground in Gaza. The president of the United States has ignored people in his own party who have said, please, we got to put some restrictions on this aid. We can't keep sending them dumb bombs that have no precision guidance, that are just obliterating mosques and hospitals and homes. I can't tell you the level of frustration and anger that Americans are feeling right now, because if they were already skeptical that this policy in Gaza was going to end well, say 2 months ago, the pictures, the images of babies, of people, it's just shattering people's minds. And it's, I think, going to really hurt President Biden in his reelection campaign. I mean, just, to infuse this with a little bit of politics, but he's having a hard time because Democrats have been more supportive of Palestinians traditionally. And they've been more skeptical of Israeli policies on the ground there. I don't want to go into the whole history of Israel and the Palestinian territories, but they expected more of him. They expect him to be a humanitarian. They expected him to uphold this rules-based order that he's always talking about. I mean, we've had to hear about it endlessly when it came to Russia and Ukraine. We had members of his staff, of the administration, blithely using terms like war crimes and genocide when it came to what the Russians were doing in Ukraine, but can't seem to let that get out of their mouths. I've heard people like Jake Sullivan say, well, I'm not a lawyer. I couldn't tell you what's going on in Gaza right now is a war crime. But yet he was using those terms very loosely when it came to Russia. And so the hypocrisy is on full display. And I don't know how they recover from that. They seem to want to have it both ways. They want to say, well, we're encouraging our Israeli partners and allies to operate within humanitarian law on the ground, but they're not willing to use the leverage that they have, which is the close to $4 billion a year that the United States gives to Israel in military aid as leverage. So it's empty. It's like, well, we've been stern with them to be better, but yet they put no muscle behind it. And the American people aren't stupid. they know what's going on. They know that the administration is trying to have it both ways. Now, do the hardcore Republicans who support Israel, like, no holds bar, do they care? No, they think Biden should be supporting Israel more. So he's not going to hurt on that end. But he's definitely hurting on his left flank with his own party, his own people, and independents, I would say too. So it'll be interesting to see, how the primaries roll out and the general election. But I do think there's going to be a reckoning in terms of the U.S. policy on Israel and our status, as it were, as a world leader. Like, what does that even mean after that? Because, most of the global South and much of the rest of the world has spoken much more forcefully about Israel. And we're between, I guess, the UK and maybe Germany, Hungary, maybe, we're pretty isolated on this issue.
Yeah, like you said earlier, it's funny from kind of the US's record for everything they've done, and that anyone could think anything of them different. They're the UK, the NATO, the most hypocritical countries on the planet. Like, it's kind of bizarre when you kind of obviously follow it, that you can even think that people can't see for what it is. These countries were empires throughout centuries, did all, world wars, slavery, all these, obviously other countries did that, all these things. And then after World War II, they no longer called themselves empires, but they carried on doing pretty similar stuff. And somehow people don't see it. Pretty bizarre. And as you said, you mentioned Jake Sullivan, but Keir Starmer, who's the opposition leader in the UK, who is pretty much aligned on everything with Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives when it comes to foreign policy, with Israel, with the airstrikes in Yemen, everything, they're completely aligned. The exact same thing. Someone put a video up of him calling Vladimir Putin a war criminal and what Russia's doing. And then they put up about him getting asked about Israel. He says, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a politician. I don't think politicians should make those standards.
I think it's unwise for politicians to stand on stages like this or to sit in television studios and pronounce day by day which acts may or may not be in accordance with international law. I think it's not the role of politicians. I don't think it's wise to do it. I come with the benefit of a lawyer of having litigated about issues like this in the past, and in my experience, it often takes weeks or months to assimilate the evidence and to then work out whether there may or may not have been a breach of international law. So I think the call for politicians to look at half a picture on the screen without the full information and form an instant judgment as to whether it's this side of the line or the other side of the line is extremely unwise, and I'm not going to get involved in that kind of exercise.
With your lawyer's hat on, is Vladimir Putin a war criminal?
Yes.
Yes.
What I've seen already amounts to war crimes, particularly the awful attacks on civilians. And I think it's very important that he's held to account and is responsible. And all those that are acting with him know that they too will be held to account. And this is something which we need to make clear now, so that those who are involved at the moment know what the consequences are.
2 or 3 minutes ago, in answer a reply to the chair, you said, and I quote, "One of the things we'd like the Israelis to do is switch the water back on." Now, that says that they turned it off. It says that you recognise they have the power to turn it on. Therefore, isn't turning water off and having the ability to turn it back on but choosing not to, isn't that a breach of international humanitarian law?
It's just something they ought to do, in my view.
No, of course they should do it. Every human being would say you don't cut people's water supply off. But I'm asking you, in your position as Foreign Secretary, around the point of international humanitarian law, if Israel have the power to turn the water back on that they turned off, surely that is a flagrant breach of international humanitarian law.
Well, I'm not a lawyer. My view is they ought to switch it on because the north of Gaza, the conflict is now effectively over there. And so getting more water and power into northern Gaza would be a very good thing to do. You don't have to be a lawyer to make a judgment about that. You just have to be a human being.
Forgive me, Sir Philip, under international obligations, do occupying powers have an obligation to provide access to water, yes or no?
You're asking me a technical legal question.
Sir Philip, I'm really, forgive me, you and I have played this dance enough times. We all know that under international law, there is an obligation for occupying powers to provide water.
You're asking me a technical question about occupying powers and what their obligations are in international law. I imagine you're correct, Chair, but I'm also not a lawyer. I also just would point out,
Philip, just bear in mind, we've come to such a good place working with you. Because we have the confidence that you do know these details, and that's what your colleagues say. You know that it's not that you presume I'm correct. That is the duty on an occupying power.
Yeah. So, Chair, I think that is right. So yes, but I would also add that in answering your questions earlier about occupation.
I'm not asking you to apply it to Israel. The facts are, though, that they are required to.
It's just so bizarre how everything that we said Russia did, whenever they bomb something civilian, they would call it out, call it war crimes, say we need to go to the UN, and then Israel does it, and there's all these different reasons why it's not, or Hamas is in there, or we've told we are working with our partners, or even times where it's got so bad, how obvious Israel's doing. There is the odd comment like Joe Biden says their bombing is indiscriminate, or Macron said too many children are dying, or David Cameron, Lord Cameron now being asked again and saying, he was asked, is Israel turning the water off a war crime? And he can barely answer it, but he says, we are concerned about that. Like, it's so blatant that it's bizarre that people can't just look and be like, whatever you think we do it for, democracy or whatever, just listen to them on Russia and then Israel, or pick any other subject about sovereignty, them occupying Syria. I don't know, it's just so difficult that people can't see that. But I know we're kind of running kind of out of time here. So I guess just last question on Israel and everything going on. Do you think there's a good chance of spreading to a regional war, or do you think we kind of seem like the tension there's eased a bit? It looks like from the outside, and I haven't looked at it in detail, that Iran and the US don't really want a regional war. Yemen obviously doing these airstrikes, the militias were attacking obviously the US bases in Syria and Iraq. That was also paused for a little while, I'm not sure now. So it seems like there are a few cooler heads who are saying we don't want a regional war. There's obviously reports that US officials believe Benjamin Netanyahu does want a regional war with Hezbollah in Lebanon or Iran, for his own political survival. So do you think there is going to be a regional war, or do you think we are a little bit past that, or that there seem to be kind of cooler heads around these other countries?
I think it's still a possibility. I don't think that we should be too sanguine about the fact that there hasn't been additional attacks against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria after the U.S. airstrikes that responded to the killing of those reservists there. I do see that Houthis are still attacking vessels and merchant vessels, as well as UK and U.S. Navy vessels in the Red Sea. And the UK and the U.S. have been responding with their own airstrikes. So that activity is still going on, but it seems to be like contained to these tit for tat attacks, but anything could probably set it off to the next level. I think I agree with you. It seems to me that Hezbollah, that's being contained right now, but those attacks on both sides have continued. I think as long as the Israeli military operations in Gaza go on the way they are, that there's going to be a risk of this spilling over into a regional conflict. I just don't know what is going to spark it. But from everything that I see and hear from Netanyahu is that they are not prepared to end this on anybody's terms but theirs, which means that they are probably willing to destroy the entire Gaza Strip and everything in it to get their way. And God knows where that's going to land the region, and the security broader for the region, what it's going to do to our relationships to anybody in the region. So I think everything's up in the air. I just looking at the devastation of the population there is just, I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime. And we are still waiting for an invasion into Rafah, where millions of people are sheltering, who haven't been eating or getting medical care for the last 3 months. God knows what that is going to look like. And another thing that I hadn't mentioned is that we spent the last 20 years talking about our responsibility to protect civilians in conflict zones. And Samantha Power, who is head of USAID operations for the United States government now, wrote a whole book about responsibility to protect. And it was from her reporting on Rwanda and this admonishment that the United States didn't get involved to protect the people there from massacres. She had made an entire cottage industry over responsibility to protect as a pillar of what U.S. foreign policy and national security should be about. And there were so many flaws in this humanitarian intervention mindset. But putting that aside, here we have one of the biggest, like I said, human catastrophes and that I have seen, that many have seen in the last century. And it's silence, radio silence from the very establishment that had been wagging their fingers about responsibility to protect for the last 20 years. They got nothing to say. If anything, they'll say something like, oh, we really have been, impressing upon the Israelis to be kinder and gentler in their military operations. And then they'll parallel that with a statement about Israel having the right to defend itself. And I'm sorry, I think history is going to not look very fondly on this establishment, on Democrats in particular, who seem to be so hypocritical and have lost their moral compass on this.
Yeah, no, I think there's the lack of sympathy, I think, from even the general population of countries towards Gaza is pretty crazy. I think part of it is that I don't think people just understand the scale of the destruction. They haven't, seen the videos. They haven't looked at the satellite images. Read, there's the Wall Street Journal and New York Times one that shows the satellite images, the stats. Over 70% buildings have been destroyed. 85% of people who have fled can't return back to their homes. That they've destroyed schools, mosques, churches. Even just like little stories in this whole big story, like them sniping the people at that. Catholic Church just gets forgotten. There's just so many things. But I think it is just, people just see it as another war, I guess, if you don't follow it. I was kind of speaking to Daniel Davis about this from the military perspective, that I think when you're not in a war, you just see it's just another war. It's just like the Iraq war. People die. That's what happens. But I asked him if he was kind of shocked by this conflict, being in wars himself. The Gulf War, the Iraq War, and 2 Afghanistan campaigns, and he said he hasn't really seen anything like it himself. So I think the actual scale of it, people probably just don't understand. I mean, a good comparison is that only 10,000 civilians have died in the Ukraine war over 2 years, and Israel did that in like 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Yep. So I think there's just a lack of seeing the info. I think if people, you said that to people, they'd be shocked, but they just don't see that. You get stuck in your own feed. I see it every day on Twitter because I follow these people. So I'm just like, someone must see this sometimes, even if you watch the news but I just think they just don't see the actual destruction, because it is incredible how much they've bombed such a obviously condensed area, and people are definitely turning, and it's just becoming too obvious, I think. So we have to see how, I guess, the Western leaders deal with that. That it's becoming that obvious, but obviously a negative note to leave it on. But thank you for coming on. I appreciate all your time. I'll put all the links in the show notes to the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Is there anything else you want to let people know that's coming up, or anything else you want to say just to close up?
No, I mean, I just impress on people to go to responsiblestatecraft.org. I mean, we got great stuff on all of these issues, and we try to cover them all. And yeah, I mean, if you're looking to read independent, non-blob thinking about Israel, about Ukraine, China, the global South, this is the place to go. And an alternative to the sort of status quo consensus thinking in Washington. And this is like the best time right now is to be thinking outside the box, obviously. So we're trying to help it along.
Yeah, what I like about your website and others is there's so much stuff foreign policy wise to follow, but you don't really miss anything. There's always an article, little article about, there was one about Azerbaijan and Armenia, like these stories that are going on and real events that are almost side stories, because there's the bigger ones like Ukraine and Israel, but there's just so much stuff. I mean, Africa as well, obviously.
Yes.
Gets forgotten. Just it's like when the Israel thing happened, it's just like the Ukraine was still going on. It was almost like it doesn't even exist anymore. But there's still someone out there in the winds, just getting shot at, getting shelled, and it just kind of the news cycle is a powerful thing. But yeah, I'll put all the links in the show notes and up on the screen. But thanks again for coming on.
Yes.
I appreciate your time, and I'll let you jump off because I'm sure you're busy. Great. Okay. Thank you. See you later.
Okay. Take care.